Good morning. This is the massive open online course for the University of Nicosia's master's degree in digital currencies. I'm Andreas Antonopoulos, and I'll be answering your questions from this week's past session on forks and segregated witness. Pretend that the previous thing didn't happen. We had a technical glitch which messed up my beautiful new banner, but you don't care. You're here for the knowledge, and we'll dive right into the knowledge. Let's see how this goes. I'm going to start with Eric's question. Eric asks, Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, what is the difference? Well, Bitcoin Cash emerged on August 1st, 2017 as a result of a hard fork change which occurred on the Bitcoin blockchain due to disagreements about the future of scaling, the roadmap for scaling. That debate resulted in a stalemate where neither side was willing to compromise, and as a result, some miners decided to create a new chain of Bitcoin called Bitcoin Cash. Bitcoin Cash increased the block size initially to 2 megabytes, and that created an incompatible chain to the original Bitcoin chain, meaning that clients that were operating under the old rules could no longer see these blocks as valid because they were larger than expected. As a result, the network forked into the blockchain forked permanently into two different blockchains that shared the common history from the Genesis block up to August 1st, 2017, but did not share any history thereafter. So until that moment, they were one blockchain, and that common history is the same. From that moment on, they diverged. On the Bitcoin BTC blockchain, Segwit was introduced, and on the Bitcoin Cash blockchain, segregated witness was not introduced, and instead the block size was increased to 2 megabytes. Now, what is the result of that? The result of that is essentially two different chains. And today those two different chains are identified as BTC, or Bitcoin, and BCH, or Bitcoin Cash. Now, let's talk a bit more about segregated witness, which was one of the things that precipitated this fork. One of the parts of disagreement about the future scaling roadmap of Bitcoin. Segregated witness was introduced on the Bitcoin blockchain as a result of a soft fork on the same day, August 1st, 2017. And segregated witness involved 4 or 5 significant changes to the way transactions are processed, and more specifically the way signatures are processed within transactions and how they are stored inside the block. So let's go to a question, and I'll go into some of the details of that. George asks, with Segwit, we eliminated transaction malleability, increased the block size, and consequently the transaction throughput, and lowered the fees. For that, we had to sacrifice the signatures, now not being hashed with the transactions and not recorded on the blockchain anymore, although still separately verified. Are there any side effects or issues deriving from that? David replies, I believe that Segwit soft fork did not increase the block size. Rather, it reduced the size of transactions, meaning more that can fit within the block, and introduced measuring the block by weight instead of size. As for the signatures, I believe these are stored on-chain in a separate Merkle tree with a hash included at the Coinbase transaction. Dimitris adds, are there any legal issues when we separate the signature from the transaction? There's a lot of confusion going on here, so let's clarify a few things. First of all, signatures were not removed from the chain. Signatures are transmitted with transactions as segregated witness. Witness means the signature, and segregated witness simply means that the signature is not embedded into the input part of the transaction anymore, but instead is carried as a separate payload in parallel with the transaction, meaning that clients that are Segwit aware transmit signatures to clients that are Segwit aware using the transaction format. Signatures are also included in the block. However, they're not included in the transaction Merkle tree, but instead have a separate Merkle tree called the witness Merkle tree that records just the signatures, just the witnesses. And the root of that Merkle tree is embedded into the Coinbase transaction, thereby becoming part of the transaction Merkle tree, thereby becoming part of the block header, thereby affecting the block hash, thereby being immutably recorded onto the blockchain. The reason this was done was to enable Segwit to be a backwards compatible soft fork that didn't break old clients. Old clients can process transactions that are Segwit enabled with the signatures segregated. They do less verification, and in fact, very few old clients are probably on the network anymore, since most, if not all of them, have upgraded to be Segwit capable. I really haven't encountered any non-Segwit clients, although those could operate on the Bitcoin network by ignoring this soft fork. And that's the essence of a soft fork. It means that old clients don't have to upgrade. Old clients no longer verify the signatures correctly, but that's okay because all of the new clients that have upgraded to Segwit do verify all of the signatures. They carry those signatures in transactions, and they record those signatures in the block, just in a different part of the block. And so functionally, the signatures are still there. They're still verified, they're still recorded in the block, they're still recorded immutably as part of the block header and the Merkle tree. They're just done through a Coinbase transaction entry for the Merkle root of the witness Merkle tree. So all of that to say, what did Segwit do? First of all, Segwit solved transaction malleability. Transaction malleability, which we'll talk about more in subsequent questions, is the ability of a third party to modify a transaction in such a way as to not change any of the essential elements of the transaction, such as who gets paid and how much they get paid. However, to do so in such a way as to modify the transaction ID or transaction hash. This problem was causing a number of issues with exchanges that were not properly verifying UTXO, as well as it was limiting the ability to chain transactions together or implement smart contracts such as those required to implement the Lightning Network. If you don't fix transaction malleability, you can't implement smart contracts, you can't implement layer 2 transactions such as Lightning Network, and you may have transaction verification problems with poorly implemented exchanges. Now, nowadays, all exchanges implement this code correctly. They check the UTXO spends instead of checking transaction IDs. However, transaction malleability has been fixed on the Bitcoin blockchain because of Segwit. Segwit also, by moving the transactions out of the part of the inputs where it was counted towards the block size and into a separate part of the block that is summarized in the Merkle, witness Merkle tree, created a situation where transactions are smaller, or they're seen and counted as smaller by older clients, and new clients measure the size of the block as a weight unit instead of the size in bytes. Together with a discount on the witness data, this allows the effective increase of the capacity of the Bitcoin blockchain by a factor of almost 4. So if every transaction was a segregated witness transaction, and the more complex transactions, the more smart contracts they have, the more complex scripts they have, the more that discount benefits the users of the network, and they can reduce their fees because fees are counted in Satoshis per byte, and if you have fewer bytes as part of the weight of the transaction, then you pay less fees. So, to answer the questions very specifically, George, signatures are stored in the transactions. They are stored in the block. They've just been moved to a different part of the systems so that they can be backwards compatible with clients that don't recognize Segwit. They're still verified, they're still validated, they're still transmitted, they're still recorded immutably on the blockchain. That hasn't changed. And to answer Dimitrios' issue, are there any legal issues when we separate the signature from the transaction? No. There are no legal issues when we separate the signature from the transaction. The signature is still validated, it's still recorded on the blockchain, you can still verify that it is correct, and it will be rejected, as will the transaction if it's not correct. So nothing has changed from a legal perspective. Although there are some people who promote this scaremongering propaganda in order to persuade people that signatures are no longer recorded on the blockchain, or that there's a legal issue where you don't have the signature in the input of the transaction but simply have it in a separate part of the block. That's not true. There's no basis for that argument. All right, let's check quickly in the chat, see if everybody's having fun, if we're doing okay. And we'll keep moving along. Everybody's paying so much attention to the video that nobody's answering in the chat, but let's go. Nadine asks, the developers of Bitcoin Cash rejected the implementation of segregated witness. In 2018, Bitcoin Cash transactions were delayed by weeks. Was this traffic a result of large block sizes? Let me answer that question first. No, it wasn't a result of large block sizes. Instead, it was a result of a bug in the mechanism used to protect the brand new Bitcoin Cash chain from hash power attacks or mining attacks, or from reorganizations. And this was called the emergency difficulty adjustment algorithm. And the emergency difficulty adjustment algorithm created these wild oscillations in the hash power of Bitcoin Cash, and in fact in the hash power of Bitcoin, as miners switched from one chain to the other in order to chase the most profitable chain each time the difficulty got emergency adjusted through the emergency difficulty adjustment algorithm, and that was then changed. So that was fixed, and those delays disappeared. Because of the way the emergency difficulty adjustment algorithm worked, it caused sometimes massive delays between blocks. So blocks were mined too slowly until the difficulty adjustment kicked back in. And that's why transactions were delayed. That's since been fixed, and now Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin are relatively stable in their hash power and have stabilized, where Bitcoin has increased its hash power quite significantly. Bitcoin Cash is a smaller fraction of the overall Bitcoin hashing power, but now stable at processing transactions. The second part of Nadine's question. The Bitcoin Cash developers are fundamentalist in their application of Bitcoin, claiming Bitcoin Cash is the truest application of what Satoshi Nakamoto intended, to include digital signatures. But does this not make the Bitcoin Cash network vulnerable to transaction malleability? Well, first of all, I don't think that it's necessarily true to call the Bitcoin Cash developers fundamentalists in the application of Bitcoin. Primarily it was a disagreement over scaling, and also a disagreement over the use of segregated witness. Of course, signatures are included in segregated witness. They're just included in a different part of the block, but that doesn't mean they're not included. However, many people in the Bitcoin Cash chain did not believe in implementing Segwit, and as a result, the Bitcoin Cash network is vulnerable to transaction malleability through signature malleability because it hasn't implemented segregated witness. As far as I know, it is still vulnerable to transaction malleability. There are some proposals to fix transaction malleability in other ways, and Bitcoin Cash has implemented a number of changes in the protocol since the initial fork. Let's go to Paula's question. Do I have to use a Bitcoin Core client to make a transaction in Bitcoin? Absolutely not, Paula. You have to use a client that conforms with the consensus rules and protocol rules of the Bitcoin network and blockchain. In fact, there are at least half a dozen clients that are compatible, especially for the simple practice of introducing transactions into the network, which simply means constructing transactions according to the consensus rules and then transmitting them to a peer. That is a fairly limited part of the functionality of the network, which means that there are many clients that can implement at least that part. In fact, most of the wallets out there do this themselves. They don't rely on Bitcoin Core or any other server, and therefore you can create transactions with any one of these wallets and it's not using Bitcoin Core. There are a number of libraries that can do this, as well as full client node libraries that implement all of the functionality that Bitcoin Core implements, including mining, such as BTCD and LibBitcoin. And those can implement everything that Bitcoin Core does, more or less, with a few differences in some of the user interface features and APIs on the client side. But on the network and consensus side, they're identical, and therefore they can remain in sync with consensus and follow all of the changes in the protocol and the rules at different schedules. So there are a number of competing clients that operate on the Bitcoin network, not just Bitcoin Core. And as a user who's using a much smaller subset, not doing mining, perhaps not maintaining a full archival copy of the blockchain, perhaps not verifying all transactions, your wallet can certainly create compatible transactions and inject them into the network without any connection to Bitcoin Core. However, keep in mind, Bitcoin Core is a very well developed and designed piece of software. So for example, the library that is used for doing the SecP256K manipulation, the elliptic curve mathematics, is one of the most efficient and most well-designed implementations of the elliptic curve that exists. And therefore, a lot of other clients use that library in order to do very fast elliptic curve. It's written in C++ primarily. It has a number of optimizations. Not only is it extremely fast, it's extremely secure and well tested for the kind of critical security bugs that happen with signatures and things like that. So Bitcoin Core is not just a client, it's also a series of libraries, and many other clients take advantage of these libraries because they're both fast and guaranteed to work with consensus. So there may be chunks of Bitcoin Core in your favorite application that you don't know about, and that's the nature of open source. That's one of the great benefits of open source. In fact, things like the libsecp256K, the elliptic curve library in Bitcoin Core, are used in many competing blockchains, both forks of Bitcoin, as well as other blockchains that also use that elliptic curve, just because it's one of the best written libraries. All right, let me take a quick break there, check in with the forum. Let's see if everything's going well. And now we're going to talk about transaction malleability, and this is a topic that is very difficult to understand because it has some weird side effects. Transaction malleability is all about changing the transaction hash without changing the essence of the transaction. Let me explain what that means. A transaction is effectively the spending of some inputs, also known as unspent transaction outputs, UTXO, which is the base unit of coins, if you like, in the Bitcoin blockchain. And in order to spend that, you provide some signatures, and then you spend that to some output outputs, which are your recipients of these payments, or maybe change that goes back to your own wallet. So a transaction is take money from inputs, prove that you own that money with signatures, spend that money to outputs in order to pay someone. Transaction malleability cannot change which inputs you're spending. It cannot change where the outputs go or what outputs you've created, and it cannot change the value, the amounts that are being spent on the outputs. However, by modifying the signatures in very subtle ways within the transaction inputs, you can effectively cause the transaction to change its hash or transaction ID. And that's because the hash is calculated with the signature, but the signature can't sign the hash because that would be circular. Meaning that when you apply the signature, you apply it on the hash of the information that is in the transaction, but then the transaction ID is produced from the hash of everything plus the signature, which means you can't secure the transaction ID with your signature until you have Segwit. With Segwit, because the signature is outside of the transaction, everything that's signed with the signature is part of the transaction hash, and it cannot be changed because that would modify the signature. Therefore, because the signature is not part of the transaction hash, it cannot be modified by a third party. Let's dive into this a tiny bit more. A signature is just a number, a mathematical calculation, but when it is affecting the hash of the transaction, that signature as a number has to be exactly the same as when applied by the person signing, without not a single bit of difference. However, because it's a number, you can transform it or malleate it in such a way that it's still the same number and therefore validates as a valid signature, but it is recorded in a different way. The bits that you store in the transaction are different enough to change the hash. One bit change, the hash changes. How can you make a number be written in a different way without changing that number? Let me give you an example. Let's say the signature was the number 10. And you write it down when you sign as 10. I take your transaction and I change that recording, so instead of 10, it's 10.0. Let's say we could use floating numbers, or 010. Well, if I put a 0 in front of 10, 010, it's still 10. However, now it's 3 digits. If you then try to verify that signature, 010 verifies because it's still 10. It's the same number, but by adding a 0 in front of it, I change the recording within the transaction. If I rebroadcast that transaction with 010 as the signature, everyone will accept it as valid because the number is still the same, but the transaction hash for that new transaction will be completely different because there's a whole new digit in front of the signature that shouldn't be there. So effectively what I've done is I've taken your transaction as soon as you've transmitted it, I've changed the signature in a subtle way that doesn't change its value, and then retransmitted it. The signature is valid, the transaction that I malleated goes through, and if it gets confirmed first, the result will be that you will have your input spent, the payer will get paid, but if you searched for the transaction on the transaction ID that you initially created, it won't exist because this transaction ID is different. And that's the essence of transaction malleability. Now let's look at the question and go into a bit more detail. Rupicha asks, on the transaction malleability on page 49, and this is an example where I send 5 Bitcoin to Antonis, I broadcast that transaction. The request contains my public key, the amount being sent, the transaction fee. It also contains my signature, proving that I own those 5 Bitcoin, and that is the witness. Now, if that signature is in the transaction, then as that signature is propagated, as that transaction is propagated across the network, its transaction ID will be seen by everybody. And that will be the transaction ID I know because I signed it. Now, Antonis could then take that transaction before it's mined, because Antonis received it too, and then change the signature by adding an inconsequential piece of data to the signature. For example, changing the number 10 into 010, which is still the same number but is now 3 digits long, and retransmit it. Now, the hash will be completely different because the signature is recorded differently, but everyone will still see it as valid. If Antonis' new malleated transaction gets recorded first, that transaction will be recorded on the network. My 5 Bitcoin will be spent. Antonis will get my 5 Bitcoin, and then he can come back and say, I never got it. If I then check the network for the transaction ID I think I transmitted, and not notice that my UTXO was actually spent but under a different transaction ID, I might assume that the payment didn't go through and then spend a different 5 Bitcoin to pay Antonis again. I can't spend the same because it's already been spent under the malleated transaction. But if I'm not paying attention to look at the UTXO and notice that it's been spent, if I just look at the transaction ID, which is an incorrect way of checking, I may be fooled into paying Antonis twice. Now, why is this important? Because this happened during the mt-gox disaster, where the wallet was repeatedly drained by attackers malleating transactions and then requesting a repeat of the withdrawal by claiming it hadn't happened, and the software running at mt-gox was checking transaction IDs instead of spent UTXOs, and as a result was paying again and again and again and again for the withdrawal, even though the withdrawals were happening, because it thought they weren't. That's the bottom line. How is it possible that Antonis still receives 5 Bitcoin? Because Antonis is simply transmitting the same transaction that I wrote to spend my 5 Bitcoin. That 5 Bitcoin is spent. The difference is it's spent with a different transaction ID. So what I should be doing, from my perspective, is checking, is that UTXO spent? Has my balance been reduced? My wallet should show 5 less Bitcoin. And it will show unless the wallet is incorrectly implemented, as it was in the case of mt-gox. That really doesn't happen anymore on the network because wallets are now smart to this particular type of attack. It can, of course, cause problems in other areas, specifically chained transactions, but transaction malleability is not really an issue of spending UTXO and then fooling the sender to think they won't spend. Let's move over to Louis' question. A transaction ID is not authoritative until a transaction has been confirmed. Absence of a transaction hash in the blockchain does not mean that the transaction was not processed, because transaction hashes can be modified prior to confirmation in a block. Could this transaction generate loss of data? How can a blockchain secure the integrity of data in this transaction? Well, the blockchain does secure the integrity of the data because it does check the signature, and therefore it validates this malleated transaction. It's the wallet that makes the mistake by checking for a transaction hash before confirmation and assuming that transaction hash, if it's not on the network, was not spent. Not true. So a transaction hash is not a good identifier for seeing if your money was spent. You need to check the UTXO, and all wallets do that today. How can a blockchain ensure this doesn't happen? With segregated witness. By fixing the fundamental mistake in the design of the Bitcoin blockchain that unfortunately Satoshi got wrong, which was by putting transaction signatures inside the transaction and using the identity of the transaction based on the signature, Satoshi made a fundamental mistake because he introduced, or she or they introduced, the possibility of malleating transactions by third parties. And there are so many different ways that you can malleate a transaction signature and therefore malleate a transaction hash that it was impossible to fix all of these different possible mechanisms for malleation. In fact, people tried. If I remember correctly, BIP65 was an attempt by Peter Wool to close all of the possible transaction malleation avenues in the signature. In the end, it was decided that this approach was just putting band-aids on top of a fundamental design mistake. And that fundamental design mistake is that signatures should never have been inside the transaction hash. Segregated witness was the ultimate fix to that. Now, there are some other malleation avenues, but they're much smaller, and those will be fixed additionally by the implementation of Schnorr signatures, which we'll talk about next. Ryan asks, Schnorr and Taproot, may you please give a brief explanation of what Schnorr signatures are and what the Taproot and TapScript proposed soft forks mean for the network? Schnorr signatures are a system of signatures that were actually introduced before elliptic curve digital signature algorithm. And Schnorr signatures are more efficient, more compact, and they have a number of really interesting properties that allow you to do some very interesting tricks, such as being able to add up the signatures in a transaction and represent them by a single signature, which is the sum of all of the signatures. And the sum of all of the signatures is also the signature of the sum of all of the public keys, which is a very interesting feature of Schnorr signatures. So why didn't Satoshi use Schnorr signatures in the beginning? Here's why. The Schnorr signatures were patented, and that patent didn't expire until I think the mid-2000s, like 2005 or somewhere like that. In fact, the reason elliptic curve digital signature algorithm, or ECDSA, was created was to overcome the patent limitations of Schnorr signatures. People couldn't use Schnorr signatures without license, so instead they created an alternative. Now, this alternative wasn't as good as Schnorr, but it wasn't encumbered by any patent or licensing. Now, in mid-2000s, the patent expired. Now, Schnorr signatures can be used by anyone, but in the meantime, elliptic curve signatures under the ECDSA algorithm are used everywhere, and the libraries are robust and it's well developed. So, Satoshi used a library that was ready and well developed. Since then, a lot of people have been working on developing Schnorr signatures and finding ways to use them in the most efficient manner. A lot of that development has actually happened within the context of Bitcoin, because a lot of the Bitcoin developers could see that Schnorr signatures would add a number of really useful properties in Bitcoin. And we'll talk about some of those properties, but bottom line is that you can do things like batch verification of transactions using Schnorr signatures. You can do aggregated, threshold, and adapter signatures, which are different tricks where, for example, you can have people add their signature one after the other and implement multi-sig with a single signature. That's called a threshold signature. And you can also do signature verification and aggregated signatures, which increases the efficiency and also the capacity of transactions. So if you can make signatures smaller, you can fit more transactions even under segregated witness. Taproot is a completely different technology, and in fact the Taproot TapScript soft forks that go together with Schnorr signatures are a group of technologies that work really well together. One of these is to represent every Bitcoin script as a tree instead of as a linear script, and that tree is stored in a Merkle tree. And this Merkleized abstract syntax tree, as it's called, or MAST, is a way to make very efficient storage of scripts. Not only is the storage of scripts efficient, but more importantly, when you present a signature, you can only reveal the part of the tree that you want to use to spend your funds, and the rest of the tree remains hidden. Nobody knows how big the tree is, how deep the tree is, how many leaves it has, how many other ways to spend that UTXO might have existed. You present the one leaf that you care about, demonstrate that it's part of the tree, and that's it. You can spend that UTXO. So that means much more efficient storage of scripts. It means the ability to scale scripts to massive numbers. You could have scripts with 10,000 clauses in them, and that would only take, I think, 13 or 14 levels in a tree in order to express a 10,000 script masked script. Taproot is basically a bridge between masked and Schnorr signatures. It allows you to represent an edge case where everybody agrees in a multisig to spend something, and instead of presenting it as a 5 of 5 multisig or a 1,000 of 1,000 multisig, you can create a special public key that is the sum of 1,000 public keys and a special signature that is a sum of 1,000 signatures, and then when you spend it with that shortcut where everyone agrees, which in many smart contracts is the default state, then it looks on the network like a simple payment with a simple single user public key and signature. So that means that you can take smart contracts that are in complex trees and make them all look like simple public key spends by a single user. In fact, at that point, all payments on the network look like a script that got paid by a single user, and complex scripts are completely hidden. You only need to execute the complex script if an exception occurs and not everyone is able to provide their signature. This is really interesting because it creates a very, very strong layer of privacy in the network by hiding all of the complexities of the script. It also creates much more scalability opportunities, because if instead of presenting a complex script that's 14 layers deep for 1,000 or 10,000 signatures, instead you produce a single signature, which takes a lot of time to produce off-chain because you have to combine the signatures of 1,000 people, but when you record it on-chain, it's a single 32-byte signature. Finally, Schnorr signatures are much more compact. The series of soft forks that combine Schnorr, Taproot, and TapScript, which are planned for sometime in the next year or two, are a great combination of privacy technologies, optimization technologies, and they open the door to a number of fixes in other places, including the ability to do batch verification and signature aggregation across transactions, as well as introducing Segwit version 1, which is the second version. Segwit v0 was the one introduced on August 2017, and Segwit v1 will be the one introduced with Schnorr, Taproot, and TapScript, and contains a number of very interesting developments in the scripting language. Unleashes a number of very complex smart contracts that now become possible with great scalability properties. Let me take a quick break there. Been talking so much, I need to drink some water. All right. Someone said the sound is fine if you're sitting right next to me at the University of Nicosia. I haven't been to Cyprus in 20 years. Every single one of these sessions is remote. Dimitris and my other friends at the University of Nicosia, I haven't actually met ever. They're sitting at a completely different place, thousands of miles from here, and we're coordinating remotely. I'm in the US at the moment, so there's no one sitting next to me. In fact, there's no one in this house right now. Coming to you live from my latest Airbnb, Green Walls. We'll call this Airbnb Green Walls. All right, let's go back to the questions. George asks about, nope, I've already done that one. Pardon me. We're going to jump right into Lightning Network, which will wrap up this session. David asks about Lightning Network auditing. For on-chain transactions, an auditor can use a block explorer. How can an auditor best check the state of a ledger where coins are held on the Lightning Network? Also, given the potential number of microtransactions that a user could enter into, how best can a user manage their records for tax purposes? Great question, David. David, an auditor can only check the state of the transactions that are terminating or originating from a node if that node provides the records. So each node holds logs, and those logs keep track of transactions that are originating at that network node and transactions that are paying that network node. Some nodes may also keep logs of transactions that are simply routed through. My node does not keep those logs. As a result, if you want to audit the Lightning Network, you can only audit a node and only if that node volunteers that information. And this is privacy. This is one of the fundamental differences between the Lightning Network and the base blockchain of Bitcoin and other blockchains that might participate in the Lightning Network, is that you can't just go to a public explorer and see everything that's happening on the network, not even with obfuscated addresses and identities. You can only see the information from a node if that node shares that information voluntarily with an auditor. The same thing for tax purposes. If you want to do your capital gains reporting, for example, and I have a node that I'm running which is part of an e-commerce store. Both the e-commerce store and the node itself are keeping logs of the exact price of Bitcoin in US dollars at the time of every payment that comes into my Lightning node. And I record that information and I share that with my accountant in order to count capital gains. With microtransactions, this becomes very, very cumbersome. And part of the problem we have, especially in the US today, is that unlike other currencies where usually there is a minimum of $600 or so, below which you don't do capital gains reporting because it isn't an investment purchase, but instead, it's not capital, but instead it's a retail transaction. That exemption does not exist in crypto. So as a result, the IRS has put itself in a situation where it creates an enormous burden on users of microtransactions who have to report every penny and then calculate minuscule capital gains and losses that inundate the tax office with pages and pages and pages and pages of spreadsheets, which amount to very little tax being paid, but a huge administrative and accounting burden, both on the side of the client who has to pay their accountant, but also on the side of the IRS that can't possibly audit hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, perhaps even thousands of pages of tiny microtransactions for what? To get a few $100s in capital gains. So not worth it. So Lightning Network auditing is not easy because Lightning Network has superior privacy to the base blockchain, and capital gains is done through traditional mechanisms by keeping records primarily at the e-commerce level of every payment that comes in, but it creates a huge burden if you go into the microtransactions area. All right, and we have a couple of additional questions for previous topics from the previous weeks. I'm going to go into those and we'll see if we can get some quick answers. Alexander asks, what do you think of delegated proof of stake, DPoS, and what do you think of EOS? I am not that familiar with EOS because I do not have the time to study every blockchain that's out there to a level of depth to have an in-depth opinion. I do have some superficial knowledge about EOS as well as its delegated proof of stake mechanism. I think the fundamental problem with delegated proof of stake is the same problem we have in political democracy and traditional systems that we use for elections, and that is voter apathy. And we've seen this happen a number of times, both in proof of stake and delegated proof of stake systems, where people delegate their vote to others to use proof of stake, but then they don't pay attention to how these delegates are voting on their behalf. The same problem you have when you elect a member of Congress, and then you don't really pay attention to how they're voting in Congress, or even you don't vote for Congress at all. And this exists in every democracy. Voter apathy is the problem. It takes a lot of work to pay close attention to all of the political machinations and games that may occur in a proof of stake system where for example, in EOS, block producers are jockeying for a position, and there have been a number of cases where block producers have been voted out of the network and have been quite bitter about it, and there's a lot of lobbying and politics and coalitions and jockeying for position, as I said before. So I think EOS is a very, very interesting experiment because what it's doing is it's exploring the areas of governance through delegated proof of stake systems that other blockchains are not exploring, and it's doing so at significant scale with significant money at stake. And that's the kind of testing you need to do to a governance system. A governance system can work perfectly well on paper, and then when you put millions of dollars behind it and there's something actually at stake, no pun intended, then things get interesting. Then you start exploring the edge cases in a game theory. Then you have an adversarial system where people are trying to profit, which is how game theory works and is a good thing, of course. But if there are weaknesses in the mechanisms of governance, that can lead to failures of the delegated proof of stake or proof of stake system. So what do I think of EOS? I think it is a very interesting experiment in governance. And experiments don't have to be successful to give us great data. In fact, we get enormous amounts of data from the things that blow up by studying very carefully how they blow up. So whether EOS succeeds or not, we're going to learn a lot because we're able to see this experiment play out at very large scale compared to previous delegated proof of stake systems. I would say the same thing about Dash, as well as a number of other prominent proof of stake and delegated proof of stake, Byzantine fault tolerance, and various variations on these consensus algorithms. You know, consensus algorithms are a brand new science, and beyond the science, they're also a mechanism for applied economics and game theory that gets very seriously tested when operated at scale with real money. So all of these systems that are experimenting with different consensus algorithms are teaching us a lot, and I think that's great. Franklin asks, what is the difference between proof of work and scope of work? Franklin, I'm afraid I don't understand this question. If you could please elaborate a bit, because I'm not sure what scope of work is in this particular context, so I won't be able to answer it. But I did want to ask you to please ask that question again and elaborate a bit more. Fedran asks, Here's a theoretical question. Would it have been possible to have a fully operational Bitcoin network if it was introduced, let's say, 5 or 10 years earlier? I am talking about the speed and reliability of the internet at the time. Was it introduced in 2008 just in time when the internet speed and capacity made it possible for such a network to exist? If the latter is the case, then it could make one think that it was more than a coincidence. No, not really. Honestly, Vajran, I think Bitcoin could have operated 5, 10, even more. Bitcoin could have operated on the internet with its scale, speed, and capacity probably all the way back to the mid-90s or early 2000s. I was operating on the internet at the time. The web existed, DNS existed. Those things were operating at fairly robust scale. Bitcoin isn't a very bandwidth-hungry system, at least not at first. And it doesn't require a lot of CPU resources. Now, if it had been bootstrapped in 1997, let's say, and then ran continuously, I think 10 years later, in 2007, the scalability problem would have been much, much worse if it had caught on earlier. But there was nothing really preventing Bitcoin from running then. Many of the peer-to-peer technologies like BitTorrent had already, I guess, launched. Probably, I remember using peer-to-peer technologies in the late 90s. I may be wrong on the timeline, but just off the top of my head, peer-to-peer technologies existed, Merkle trees existed, digital signatures existed. Yeah, something very much like Bitcoin could have been done then. Does that mean it was launched because of the economic crisis? I don't think so, because the time it was launched was pretty much right on the brink of the economic crisis, unless it was developed and kept secret until then, but I think that's really unlikely. I think it was mostly a coincidence, and perhaps a coincidence that accelerated its deployment and development as Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever they might be, noticed that the world economy was in crisis and used that as a motivation to launch this faster, maybe before it was quite ready, or maybe they were not quite done with testing, but they launched it. Who knows? This is all speculation, of course. Nothing technical prevented Bitcoin from existing earlier, I don't think. Mihail asks, is Ethereum the next Bitcoin? No. I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is because I think that Ethereum specializes in a completely different application domain and different use cases. I don't think Ethereum does what Bitcoin does, and I don't think it can or wants to really, because that would severely constrain its development speed and flexibility. It would have to become much more conservative in order to serve the application role that Bitcoin serves. I don't think Bitcoin could do what Ethereum does for the same reason. Bitcoin would have to be much more flexible, much less conservative, much more faster in its development cycle, which would undermine its fundamental role as a very robust, very secure system that can defend against collusion between nation states and broad-based attacks. So for all of those reasons, I think Bitcoin and Ethereum occupy parallel, separate, slightly overlapping niches, but where the center of the use case of each niche is distinct enough that they do not really compete head-to-head. And I think that applies with many cryptocurrencies. The ones that are successful and get first mover advantage solidify their position in an application niche. If they try to compete too closely with something that already exists and not differentiate enough, then the first mover advantage is almost insurmountable and they can't succeed. If they differentiate a lot in order to move further away from the first mover, then they no longer occupy the same application space and they can specialize in a different niche and perhaps succeed in being the first mover in that niche. So I think there are a couple of niches that are emerging: smart contracts, robust sound and very secure money, privacy, very strong privacy systems, resource allocation and sharing systems perhaps, such as storage, memory, CPU, and things like that. But we'll see. It's very early to tell, and these things don't always go the way the designers had hoped for. People tend to use technology for their own uses and find uses of the technology that the designer did not anticipate. The market decides ultimately what the niches are, which applications are perfect for the time and the audience when they are launched, and which systems gain enough first mover advantage to firmly establish themselves. Once a market gets into that configuration, I think the only thing that allows it to shake up is there's either a fundamental change in the way the market operates, like for example, when we went from 5 big photography manufacturers that made cameras to suddenly every phone having a camera, and that shook up the photography business enough to reorder the leaders in that business, and some of them went out of business. That kind of first mover advantage and that kind of solidified market doesn't get shaken up unless you change the parameters of the market dramatically through the introduction of some radical new technology that's very disruptive. That may happen. Until that happens, unless one of these systems fails for its own reasons through internal division or a very, very fundamental and long-lasting bug that takes the system down, I think a lot of the first movers in this space enjoy such an advantage that they're almost impossible to unseat. So Ethereum is not the next Bitcoin. Ethereum is the next Ethereum, and Bitcoin is the next Bitcoin. I recently did a video about that if you're interested in watching it. And that's it for today's session. Thank you all for coming. I hope you had fun and learned a lot. This is the massive open online course for the University of Nicosia's master's degree in digital currencies. I'll see you next week with the next session in our program. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for participating. Thanks for asking great questions in the forum. Don't forget to keep asking questions throughout the week. Have conversations with your fellow students. See if you can work out some of these problems. I noticed this week several of the questions were actually answered by other students, and I just had to reinforce those learnings. So please participate and interact with your fellow students. Ask great questions, and I'll see you next week. Take care.